Lena, with your permission, what if we have one or two videos as background about Paris? Because, or let me ask, how many of you have been to Paris? So about half. Okay. Why is that a significant question? Because of Benjamin, and Benjamin was trying to look at history, the world, including post-industrial society. He did not use that term from Daniel Bell. But if we look at society before there was industry, that's what we had in Paris at the time of the revolution. And the English started building factories, they were building factories about then, and making London a very smoky, dirty city. A few people started to build factories in Paris or nearby Paris, and as soon as they did, it was smoky. And the Parisians said, "Stop, we can't have smoke in Paris." And so the others said, "Oh, but this is the industrial age. We have to have smoke in factories." And they said, "Not in Paris, never." And that's what happened. Okay, how could Paris succeed without industry, which was the centerpiece of transformation of the economy? If you read Marx, if you read many others, it's implicit in Adam Smith. And so Benjamin basically studied Paris for that reason, not because he wanted to write a history, but because he wanted to understand the transformation of history, of the evolution of styles of life, and so forth. But his reflections on Paris in turn came through many other things. And that's what we need to have put a little bit before us. And I think it's easier to see a little bit of these components, especially with some of the videos which we have here. So let's give it a try, please, Wenmeo, just in the order from the top to the bottom. Go through a couple of these, and we can have some comments, have a little discussion before and after each. But the first is, okay, let's just go ahead. Haussmann.
45, a French social reformer wrote, "Paris is an immense workshop of putrefaction, where misery and pestilence and disease work in concert, where sunlight and air rarely penetrate. Paris is a terrible place, where plants wither and perish. Industrialization and rapid growth had simply left infrastructure behind, and in the 19th century, Emperor Napoleon III undertook one of the most ambitious plans of renovation ever undertaken in any city, anywhere. And to oversee that renovation, he chose the skillful and audacious George Eugene Haussmann. And between 1853 and 1870, Haussmann transformed Paris from a squalid, disease-ridden city of the Middle Ages to the modern era with broad avenues, effective sewers, and beautiful parks. It is history that deserves to be remembered." By the 19th century, the overcrowding of Paris had become an acute social issue. As far back as 1739, the writer Voltaire had complained that the streets were showing off their filthiness and spreading infection. The first Napoleon had ambitious plans as well, writing from his prison on St. Helena, that if he had had 20 more years of rule and a little leisure, one would vainly search today for the old Paris. Nothing would remain of it but vestiges. The widest streets in the worst neighborhoods were only 5 meters, the narrowest only 2. Carts and horses could hardly navigate these parts of the city. Elected the first president of France in 1848, Napoleon III worked as president to beautify the city, but was able to accomplish very little. It wasn't until he overthrew the government and declared himself emperor that the project would begin in earnest. After selecting Haussmann to oversee the project, the emperor asked him to give the city more air and space, to make it beautiful and to better connect the sprawling capital. The first stage of the project was to complete the Grand Croisée de Paris, a great cross that would bisect the center of the city, and which had begun under the first Napoleon. The emperor wanted a new hotel built, the first luxury hotel in the city, the Grand Hotel du Louvre, in time for the Exhibition Universelle in Paris. The exhibition was a kind of World's Fair held in 1855. It was held partially as a response to the Great Exhibition held in London 4 years earlier. Haussmann relished the challenge and worked 24 hours a day, had 3,000 workmen finish the most important parts of the cross and the hotel in time for the exhibition. The project involved tearing down enormous sections of the city, a task that Haussmann called the gutting of old Paris. Many of the neighborhoods torn down were simply turned into the broad avenues that define the city today, and many small streets were eliminated entirely in favor of one navigable one. This was only possible because Napoleon III had made himself emperor. He had the parliament change the law so that Haussmann could seize land on either side of the streets, and he reported only to the emperor himself. Haussmann finished the cross in 1859, centered at a large square that was widened with 2 new theaters, which still stand today, facing each other across the Fontaine de Palmer, a victory fountain built under Napoleon I to memorialize his greatest military victories. The fountain itself was moved to sit at the exact center of the square and redecorated with sphinxes and more, designed by architect Gabriel Davioud. Davioud was almost as important to the project as Haussmann. While Haussmann worked on the greater design of the city, Davioud was the architect for many notable buildings built during this time, including the theaters in the central square, as well as other distinctively Parisian street furniture. He designed benches, balustrades, fountains, signposts, and much more during the renovation. This work, as well as that of other architects under Napoleon III, had a unique style, much of which can still be seen all over Paris today. One architect who designed during this time called the style simply Napoleon III. Possibly the most distinctively Haussmann part of the whole renovation were the buildings he built to line the streets of Paris. Haussmann planned the apartment complexes as architectural wholes, treating them, as he treated everything in the project, as part of a larger urban design. While the interiors of the building were left up to the owners, the exteriors were strictly regulated. Uniformity of balconies and cornices was prioritized, even to the detriment of interior rooms. The facades were required to be either made or faced with stone, and the changes of the Industrial Revolution made it possible to cut and move the stone like never before. It is Haussmann's apartments, which line the streets of Paris still, that have left the most lasting mark on the character and appearance of the city.
Okay, that's good. That's 4 minutes. That's the beginning, and you get a flavor of how much the Paris of today is really the creation of Haussmann and the emperor. The second one, let's try. Yeah, let's just go ahead with maybe the next one or two. Yeah. So the first one is says show all, 1 minute 34 seconds. That's the over. Okay, go ahead.
An intoxication comes over the man who walks long and aimlessly through the streets. With each step, the walk takes on greater momentum. Ever weaker grow the temptations of bistros, of shops, of smiling women. Ever more irresistible the magnetism of the next street corner, of a distant square in the fog, of the back of a woman walking before him. Then comes hunger. He wants, however, nothing to do with the myriad possibilities offered to sate his appetite, but like an animal he prowls through unknown districts in search of food, in search of a woman, until utterly exhausted he stumbles into his room, which receives him coldly and wears a strange air. That anamnestic intoxication in which the flaneur goes about the city not only feeds on the sensory data taking shape before his eyes, but can very well possess itself of abstract knowledge, indeed of dead facts, as something experienced and lived through. This felt knowledge, as is obvious, travels above all by word of mouth from one person to another. From The Arcades Project by Walter Benjamin.
Okay, what are just stop for a second. Now, what are the arcades? The arcades used to be individual shops, but it rains in Paris or almost drizzles from roughly October until April, nonstop. It's a dreary, rainy place. And if you go out and walk, you can't stand in front of a glass window case. So the idea was they built a cover on top of the street, which joined the multiple shops, and these were called arcades. And that's the title of Benjamin's book, The Arcade Project. This was around 1820, 1830, but then by the end of the century, this became instead department stores. And then by the late 20th century, this became malls, mid to late 20th century. So these were transformations of the shopping experience, but also how people would see and relate to each other and think about, conceive of shopping. So let's go on a little bit more. The source, well, okay, the main, what was Benjamin's main source in this book? Was it the buildings? A little bit. Was it the politics? A little bit. But the detail of what went on in people's heads, which was the big issue, he drew on what and whom? Baudelaire, who was the leading public intellectual poet of the late 19th centuries, mid to late 19th century, simultaneous with these transformations. And let's show a little bit about Baudelaire in conjunction with these other changes. Gothic literature is an American version, an American term, not uniquely American, it's also elsewhere, but it's a style which has been captured in social media websites. And the woman who will talk to us is dressed and her style is Gothic, Black. So let's push on with bits of Baudelaire and her perspective. Here she is.
Tame his bohemian spirit. However, he left the vessel and returned to Paris. At age 21 in the year of 1842, he inherited his father's fortune and began his literary career in the Latin Quarter of Paris. It is believed around this period that he contracted syphilis from frequenting prostitutes. Oh boy. At this time, he met his notorious mistress, Jeanne Duval, a Creole woman of whom his family did not approve. She was one of 4 women who inspired Charles Baudelaire's greatest work, Les Fleurs du Mal. During their lengthy and stormy relationship, Jeanne Duval was emotionally abusive toward Charles. She delighted in toying with him, having affairs with friends of his, getting him hooked on drugs such as hashish and opium, and getting him deeper into debt. So this relationship continued on and off throughout the years. He also had a relationship with painter and model, the beautiful Apollonie Sabatier, and actress Marie Dabrun. Charles was also a big fan of wine and was a famous absinthe drinker. By 1844, he had squandered at least half of his inheritance, prompting his family to fight for a lawyer to handle Charles's finances and provide him with an allowance until his death. His writing career began with art criticism, and he also released an autobiographical novella titled La Fanfarlo in 1847. Prior to releasing Les Fleurs du Mal, his greatest achievement in writing was considered to be his English to French translations of Edgar Allan Poe's work. They are widely considered to be among the best. In 1857, he finally published the first edition of his greatest work, Les Fleurs du Mal. Quite obsessed about ensuring the quality of his work, he took a room next to the publishing house so he could oversee the process. 6 of the poems in the collection, however, were banned in France until 1949, containing subject matter such as lesbianism and vampires. The second edition of Les Fleurs du Mal, he added 35 poems. One of the things Les Fleurs du Mal is known for is its explicit sexual content, the link between beauty and decay, and, significantly, the relationship between death and sensuality. Because of his personal eccentricities and his work, he was dubbed Poète Maudit, the cursed poet in French. One friend even reported that Charles, in the midst of conversation, asked him, "Wouldn't it be agreeable to take a bath with me?" I can imagine his friend was something like, "Dude, I love you, but not that much. Stay back." In the 1860s, Charles's health began to decline. In 1862, he started suffering from horrible nightmares. When he left for Brussels to give some lectures in 1863, a series of strokes left him partially paralyzed. He finally passed away August 31st, 1867, at the age of 46, most likely from syphilis. So, there's a brief biography on Charles Baudelaire, and trust me, it only scratches the surface of the man himself. But Adrian, you ask, what would you recommend if we want to get...
Okay. Yeah, the next one has just, I think, a little bit of his actual poetry.
So you mean the third video?
Yes, 1, 2, 3. I think you showed the third. I think this is the fourth. It's just below. It should start at 3 minutes, 3 minutes and 5 seconds, and just go till 5:47.
Yeah,
It ends with FME.
yeah, I see.
And he will even pick out very extremely minute details in the pieces of art in question, and I really, really love that. So anyone who is wanting to learn about artwork during the 19th century or wants to have a greater appreciation for it, I think should really get their paws on this. And if you do happen to get your paws on it, I highly encourage you to look up these pieces of art on Google. They're easily accessible to you now on Google. You can look these up and examine them for yourselves, and absolutely, I very much encourage you to pick out the little details that Charles describes here, because it makes all the difference and gives you a whole different perspective on something that you may just take a shallow glance over. I mean, in looking, like taking a first glance at these pieces of art when I was first reading this book, I was just like, okay, I see what you got here, okay, anything else? And then I look at some of the subtle details in here that Charles describes, and I'm just like, whoa, that's cool! I dig that! Another thing I enjoyed about this book in particular was hearing Charles's deepest and uttermost thoughts about the popular writers of his time. And most notably, of course, he does mention Edgar Allan Poe and praise him very highly. As a matter of fact, I will find you a passage, because I really think it's important to get a perspective on Edgar Allan Poe from someone who actually lived in this time. Because nowadays it's all kerfluffled. We also don't have a very good perspective on who Poe was, other than from his rival Rufus Griswold, who wrote that scathing biography / obituary about him following his death. Now, let me just find that passage about Edgar Allan Poe that I really wanted to share with you. All the documents I have read had led me to the conclusion that the United States was nothing but a vast prison house for Poe, within which he moved in a state of feverish agitation, like someone born to breathe sweeter air, and that his inner spiritual life as a poet, or even as a drunkard, was a constant struggle to escape from the influence of his hostile atmosphere. Whoa. It's really fascinating to get a load of Charles Baudelaire's analysis as well as commentary on Edgar Allan Poe's life and how it influenced his works. Really fascinating. I repeat that, as far as I'm concerned, I am persuaded that Edgar Allan Poe and his mother country were not on a level. And in discussing Edgar Allan Poe and his aesthetics and his intellectual skill, as well as his creativity, we can certainly come to a consensus on that very same thought.
Okay. Um, well, there's one more with just a little bit of his actual poetry, I think. Or no, maybe I cut it off. Is it, do you have another, or is that the end? Okay, all
Yeah.
right, let's just to sort of link this to Benjamin and, well, and the broader context. Just post his background for a minute here. The names of the Frankfurt people affiliated with the Frankfurt School. Frankfurt names, there are lots of people. And what you have here is an effort to move from Marx to build a Marxist cultural analysis, including making the interior of the mind become part of the analysis. So the two leaders were Horkheimer and Adorno. Marcuse went to California and was a major 1968 writer. Pollock, Eric Fromm, again, was in the US and an psychoanalyst. Kirchheimer, Leo Lowenthal was a professor at Berkeley and worked on content analysis of popular culture. Siegfried Krakauer, Walter Benjamin were reading. Lauren Langman, these are people in Chicago who today call themselves Frankfurt sociologists. Los Angeles, the impact was strong on Michael Deere, Mike Davis, Alan Scott, and Edward Soja. Then, to scroll down a little more, related persons extending. Well, this was, Lukács was somewhat distinct for sure, but he was in dialogue with them. The Italian Gramsci, who I won't try to summarize. Foucault, you probably know better, and Bourdieu, Derrida. These three or four basically trying to use culture to be an exterior, forceful, constraining activity in its own right. And they were basically developing what was called postmodernism. Bruno Latour then did a PhD which followed this to some degree, but then in his later work, Latour really shifted against this and made a creative video on Paris, which was teasing and making fun and showing how the theories of these people could not have been true if you just look at some of the buildings and surrounding activities. Okay, this is background. This is a good photo. This is Adorno in the center, smiling as if he's, aha, here's something I've got we can do. It was Horkheimer, who was the organizer. They would ride to Communist Party cell meetings in the large Mercedes driven by a chauffeur, which belonged to Horkheimer in Frankfurt. And in the back, with his hand on his hair, is Habermas, a young assistant. And that was roughly the way he and they looked when I was a student in Frankfurt myself. So let's, with that kind of background, pictures and so forth, Lena, why don't we let you talk a bit about them, and then I'll begin to fill in with other pieces contingent on what you have to say. Is that reasonable?
That sounds good.
Okay, great.
So I'm just, yeah, so I informed myself a little to put these readings more in context. So I'll just share some of that. So pretty much these philosophers, I guess, of the Frankfurt School, they were kind of adding on, we're building up on the Marxist idea. So Marxism proposed that the working class is going to rise up against the bourgeoisie, but now, like, many years later, during like the 1940s, when the Frankfurt School was established, I guess. So that was the time, at least that one paper we read by Adorno and Horkheimer was written. So the working class hadn't risen up, and the capital class was very strong. So the question was why they didn't rise up, and so sorry. So the critical theory believes that art makes people conform. So the pleasure that one takes in art correlates with the relaxed acceptance of the world in which it exists.
Okay, just to interrupt to say, very important sentence. That is, you indulge people, you have them bring inside themselves the feelings and the emotions toward life by using art. Okay, that's just restating, and that's a major kind of supposition here. Go ahead.
Yeah. So the form of art that is promoted is art that turns itself against it. So anti-culture. That's kind of how I understood it. And the reason is that if I'm consuming art and I'm happy with it, I accept the world that I exist in. But the critical theorists of the Frankfurt School were saying like art should make me in a sense unhappy, so that I question the society that we exist in. So, and then also the participants of the Frankfurt School, especially Adorno and Horkheim, they had an interesting story. So they were from Germany, and they founded the Frankfurt School at the Frankfurt University. But because they were Jewish, they once World War II, took off everything, they left to go to the US, and they stayed there for, I'm not exactly sure how they divide up their time, but at one point they did return in the 1950s to continue the Frankfurt School, but they were also very active from like the 1940s on in the US. And as Professor already mentioned, had a lot of connections also to Chicago, and they were in LA a lot. So also influenced a lot of people here. So, but also interestingly, they were not a fan of either. So they did not really think the European culture gave this room to criticize society, but also they were not a fan of Hollywood and the US culture. And I don't know with which reading I should, if I should start with Benjamin or Adorno and Horkheim, if there is a preference of which one I should give an overview of first.
Maybe Adorno, in the sense that the Adorno, well, or let me, yeah, sure, go ahead. Maybe Adorno first. They were briefly in England and then New York, but most of their time was in Hollywood. And there was a colony of radical German, Austrian, European refugees who built a whole perspective with each other. But I don't want to go on about that, but I'm making the point that Hollywood and the subculture of emigres who lived and talked and were very close to one another was a critical subculture, in a sense, where they spent much of their time. They did not at all collaborate and enjoy the main Hollywood big successful blockbuster films. They were building the opposite. But go ahead, and Alyssa, are you gonna? Yeah, well, go ahead with what you have, and
Yeah, I'm just,
I'll come back. So
yeah,
this part of
yeah.
Hollywood, this aspect of Hollywood was a critical location for the Frankfurters.
Yeah. Yep. So I'm just going to take off with their essay on the culture industry. So they were they denunciated the culture industry, and they claimed that society had no longer could no longer nourish freedom and individuality, because the cultural production moved to an industrial stage, and there was no individual effort or investment required. They saw so they saw that the modern culture industry represents an average life of purpose, of pure entertainment or distraction, as seductively and realistically as possible. So they claim that there's no general or particular. So under the monopoly is what they said was this culture industry, I guess. All mass culture is identical. So there's a unity of microcosm and macrocosm, and a false identity of the general and the particular, because all this culture is identical. And they legitimatized the culture industry legitimatized everything they were doing, because they claimed that the standard that was used was based on, in the first place, on the consumer's needs, and this resulted in manipulation. And here, a sentence in the text which I thought was which I just got kind of stuck on, and I had to think a couple times about it, was that there's no mention is made of the fact that the basis on which technology acquires power over society is the power of those whose economic hold over society is greatest. So here they connect this this technology power, which is also like connected to this entertainment industry through like TV, news, Hollywood, to the upper class that has the economic power. So I guess so. This what I found points out that they think that these are the people that are kind of in control over this whole culture industry that that controls and manipulates the working class. And so this makes consumers, they start to appear only as statistics, which can get analyzed and then used to aim the propaganda specifically at them. And the aim is also to make real life indistinguishable from the movies, so that any entertainment or art does not leave any room for one's own imagination or reflection. So this all happens with the aim of achieving obedience to the social hierarchy, which means just keeping the working people in their place. And the individual is an illusion. He's only tolerated as long as he identifies with the generality and does not question this. And also what I wanted to mention in the beginning is that I hope I don't get this mixed up, but I think it was Adorno who was also a composer. So this is also why they really discussed art like that was just a focus that they had. Yeah, so that's kind of the overview I wanted to give about the culture industry.
Okay, that was great. I will point out that yes, Adorno was a composer, and that's what he thought of being at the beginning of his life. What he wrote was very exotic, atonal, very difficult, harsh music to understand or to listen to. And he is not popular as a composer at all. But his life then thereafter really was largely, roughly half of his writing was about music. And so we've asked before, when Mao asked about how about dance, how about other things, I would say one reason to look at the literature about music is, I'm being slightly judgmental, but I would say it's more sophisticated than certainly the most writings about art, painting, sculpture, or dance. And there simply is more subtle, advanced analysis of how it works. And Levi-Strauss was an illustration in using musical components, but Adorno did that as well. But the Adorno, there were two Adornos, we can say, to simplify. The first was the Adorno you just heard described. The Adorno of the Hollywood essay, the Adorno who simplifies, who takes most analysis directly from Marx combined with Freud. And so Freud, in a sense, is the seductive incentive of beauty, which brings you in and captivates you, but then you swallow the Marxist pill and you will become a beaten down proletarian, and you are not class conscious or self-conscious politically. But as this was happening in Adorno's writing so successfully, and Hollywood style domination was so omnipresent, he said basically, and this was now he said this for years, but it became more explicit in the 60s, in the early to mid 60s. Frankfurt, the city, and these two were among the most charismatic of all German academics. So they had, when I was a student there, there would be students from medical school, law school, social science, government, whatever, and there were maybe 500 or so students in each class. Students would come there often from all over Germany just for maybe a month or 3 months, and would not be full-time continuing students. They were there even though they would become doctors or lawyers, but they wanted to have contact with the great Adorno and Horkheimer. Adorno, I would say, placed himself explicitly at the top. Horkheimer raised the money, coordinated, built the infrastructure, kept things going. But the two of them signed a number of things together. But the second Adorno, or let me just restate, adding one more point. Over the 20th century, as it was clear that we were not about to see a Marxist revolution in the manner described by and predicted by Marx, and Adorno said that quite explicitly. He said, there is no point in trying to fight any of this. We have lost. And what we can do, and should do is become critical theorists. And that term was created by Adorno as an alternative to battling in the streets or writing in a way to try to build a leftist political party, or demonstrate, as students were trying to do, and we're doing more and more. Many of the student leaders from Paris, from Berkeley, from Columbia, either went to or read the books of these Frankfurters, most of them they read when they went as persons in America, like Herbert Marcuse was in California, was widely read by Americans. Most Americans did not go to Germany. And when I went there, for instance, and listened to the lectures in German, and I read the books in German, I talked to the students, I said, this is very difficult German. And the students would say, yes, absolutely. We read the books in English because we can't understand the German either. Okay, so it's very tough stuff. And esoteric, like the subtle music of Adorno. So I'm giving you, in a sense, Adorno's first perspective. Yes, the world has been destroyed by Hollywood and by capitalist manipulation, but what can we do about it? Don't join the ranks of the proletarian and try to revolt like Lenin or Mao. Instead, become a critical theorist and write about it and show that the aesthetics is destructive and bad. And here, there was a huge conflict between Adorno on the one hand and many of the students who came to listen to him on the other, because they were the beginnings of the 1968 student revolt, which grew more and more and more active year after year in Frankfurt, Berkeley, Columbia, Paris, in these years. So as he was saying, give up, you can't change the world, write critical theory. But he was also writing about music, about art, about many other things in many long, subtle, complicated essays. So that's the second Adorno, the very subtle cultural analyst who may have had some of the things which you have heard described very well by Lena, and you can see it in this famous, this is one of the most famous essays, also because it's so clear, it's so simple, and I would say simplistic. It does not give you the subtlety of Adorno, which you can find if you read his more subtle works, which show you how creative and subtle a mind he actually had. But instead, you find a very simplistic kind of story here. And it was one which alienated a number of others, including Benjamin. So just to mention one more illustration, when I was a student, Adorno said one day, "You felt the boot of Hitler when you were here." Horkheimer and I went to America where it was worse, because people were smoking cigarettes, driving those big cars, drinking alcohol, and it was all imposed upon them by capitalism. Okay, so there's no choice or minimal choice in that essay, whereas in other places of Adorno, there clearly is. So I'm using that as an illustration of the simplistic style which you heard summarized. Maybe to get some of the ideas out, which Lena has done very well for this first essay. How about then looking at one reaction of Benjamin, who did not get his doctorate with Adorno and Horkheimer. His doctorate was in literature, and he was considered by many to be the most creative, brilliant, general intellectual of Weimar Germany in all fields. At the same time that he was critical and eclectic and subtle and did, so I'm holding up the book, The Arcade Project, but he wrote many other books. And before he went to Paris, maybe the first half of his career, he wrote a book on Moscow. He wanted to understand communism in action. So he was Marxist in background, in general orientation, but he wasn't a dogmatic Marxist at all. That's the big point. He drastically changed the core of Marxist theory. but he didn't announce it. He didn't tell you he was doing that. But for himself to get a sense of how it was working, he went to Moscow, he spent time there and wrote a book on the city of Moscow in the sense of communism in practice in a major city. Then he wrote a book on Berlin. And here he was particularly subtle because he just knew it in detail himself. And then many essays on all kinds of things like photography. And so Adorno, one of his points was anything that is mechanical or creates a cultural product that is reproduced like a photograph, a recording of music that you play on a phonographic recording, or later on, of course, the cell phones, which he didn't see, but things like that. All of these were commodifying, and that term is from Marx, commodifying culture and making it into an industrial product, which was cheaper, could be diffused more easily, but also then standardized. And so you have the terms like Fordism, that the world is a production line like the Model T, a Ford car. And so actually before we leave, let's just show one more example of this, which I think I sent to you maybe yesterday, or yeah, where is it? Yeah, I think I sent it to you, Wenmao, yesterday for I have two little sections. You see that one? The first one really is of the Vietnam War. And that really is only in German, and I couldn't find any subtitles for that. But the simple idea is that Vietnam was the first war that American citizens saw on television. And it horrified Americans enough. I shouldn't make it too simply Adorno-esque simplistic. There were many other alienating aspects of the Vietnam War. But one was that the killing was shown in subtle detail in the images. And that in turn led to many demonstrations, and then these were repeated in Germany and France and elsewhere. And these led to an anti-Vietnam series of movements. And so let's just show, this is a minute and 54 seconds. So you can see Vietnam, you can see this, the commodified, so what he says, Adorno then is going to talk about it, but what he says is the anti-Vietnam was a standardized commodified reaction against a commodified war. And so the demonstrators were not original, they were not doing creative theory, they were just holding up signs that were the same everywhere. And in Paris, in Berlin, in Chicago, in California. So let's just see that, and then the next one is Adorno interpreting this in his words with subtitles.
Der Vietnamkrieg solidarisierte die Menschen durch das Fernsehen. Die US Army erobert ein Bauerndorf und zündet es an, vor den Augen der Welt. Das Fernsehen brachte Bilder ins Wohnzimmer, die niemand bestellt hatte und die jeder innerlich kommentieren musste, ob er wollte oder nicht. Zur Empörung gesellte sich, ebenso weltweit, eine Musik, die im Nachhinein entsetzlich kitschig klingt, damals aber ein Mittel des Protests war. Es war die erste Welle der Globalisierung, an deren Ende alle Jugendlichen die gleiche Musik hörten und die gleichen Hosen trugen, ob in Amerika oder Asien oder Europa. Einer wie Adorno hatte das sofort durchschaut.
Ich glaube allerdings, dass Versuche, politischen Protest mit der Popular Music, also mit der Unterhaltungsmusik, zusammenzubringen, deshalb zum Scheitern verurteilt sind, weil die ganze Sphäre der Unterhaltungsmusik, auch wo sie irgendwie modernistisch sich aufputzt, so mit dem...
And let's go to the one with subtitles, which has the same interview with subtitles as the second one. So let me pause for a second. What that said was commodification was going on through television, and the inner minds of the viewers of this saw a standardized image of war, and they then reacted with a standardized set of protest songs, protest themes, not creativity at all. Okay, so commodification was the driver of this.
But I only have this one.
No, you should have two that I sent you, I think, yesterday.
Yesterday, you only sent me one video link.
No, maybe I made a mistake. Let me see what I've got here. Well, okay, let's not bother to, if you find something else, fine. Or you see the email from me at least, or yeah, let me just look for 1 second. So I sent this to you. Thought and sound, there's one on sound. Is the one that you just played 9:24 p.m.?
Yeah.
Okay, then let me go on down, settings, and then Benjamin, okay. All right, so yeah, so it looks like it was my mistake that I don't see it, so I don't see it there. So let's skip it. But basically, what he says is that these singers, and he particularly targets Joan Baez, who was the most popular American folk singer, and who would sing, as you saw the woman playing there, at Vietnam protest demonstrations. And this was popular music. He hated popular music. And because it was crude, industrial, simplistic, and his interpretation was, it was also commodified and responded to simplistic categories rather than being his kind of individualized, subtle music. So basically he's making the point that any kind of popular music was bad because it was so simplistic, and it was a product not directly of Hollywood, but of anti-Hollywood and anti-Vietnam War, anti-television, took over the categories of being commodified and not encouraging specific alternative views. So you've heard us discuss this in terms of diversity today. That is, the diversity themes tend to be simplified, oversimplified, and to be applied to certain subgroups, even if they don't fit, would be his general commentary and what we're seeing today compared to the past. So the that's basically his interpretation, and his in that sense you could say his elitism. So in a sense, there's an interesting combination of elitism, of saying we don't want simple theory, we don't want stuff for simple people, they have no minds of their own, the proletariat is not a revolutionary class, they're simply they're just smoking these cigarettes and getting drunk, and they're not capable of anything better, was the line that he was elaborating. Okay, that in turn led people around him, and of course what was happening in Weimar at the time was battles in the streets between the Nazis and the communists. You didn't have you didn't have 3 or 5 or 10 political parties. Those two were in the streets and they beat up everybody else. and they dominated. And so that in turn was illustrating in the street battles the kind of dichotomization that he was writing about and imputing when he talked about Hollywood. Okay, but he was using Hollywood as the archetypical popular culture. And he made the point there briefly that you have the same categories even in Europe and Asia as you do in Hollywood, because it has been globalized. So he showed the people at the end having the dropping from the air of these kinds of things, which they decorated their faces with, as of flowers and flower-like ribbons and so forth, which were the physical components of the counterculture, standardized forms of dress, which showed you had green hair or red or purple hair, that you were not like your parents, that you were in continual revolt. So that was the couple at the end, the guy with the hat, the woman with her, that is, they weren't ribbons which she chose herself. They were dropped in a globalized way from the air, that everybody would wear these kinds of things and therefore show that they're part of one integrated, culturally distinctive counterculture. Okay, so that's the Adorno simplified version. Benjamin was too smart for this. He was battling his life through the second half, especially of his life. He was writing all these essays, trying to see why was Marx wrong and why was Adorno trying to apply Marx using culture. Using culture was the right way to go. He wanted to do the same thing, study culture, because culture was so important, but not to do it the way Adorno and Horkheimer and most of the school of their followers had done. On the other hand, he was close enough to them, and most of the left and most of the potential. He had in his later years, he had very little money. He was, and then after 1933, he was trying to escape, or I want to try to get my dates right. Yeah, I think it was 1940. He was trying to cross the Parisian Spanish border, and he was killed basically. But in that particular period in Paris, he was trying to raise money from people who were essentially neo-Marxists. Another one, which is on the reading list, I'll add here, is a selection of readings by the top German Marxist intellectuals, including others like Thomas Mann. But after 1933, the Germans did not subsidize, or that is Hitler did not subsidize, leftist Marxist art. The Russians did. The Russians and Stalin were very active in subsidizing the arts, and we'll see more of that. But basically, they selected a safe person from a Marxist standpoint. This is it's the beginning of page 12 on the syllabus. Georg Lukács, Realism in the Balance, in this edited book by Ernest Bloch called Aesthetics and Politics. Other chapters of the book contain interesting debates among Bertolt Brecht, Walter Benjamin, Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, and Fromm were in the US. But the point is, these were the top German Marxist cultural theorists. They were talking, however, about especially German expressionism, which is a sort of a German version of Baudelaire's ugly art, I would say, to simplify. Shocking colors, shocking themes, and these writers completely split among themselves in terms of whether or not German expressionism should be subsidized with their Russian communist money. Is it good communism or not? And so the question is, does communism and Marxism have a link to the right or the wrong aesthetics? That was their debate. And they basically wanted to say yes, otherwise, why are we using Russian money and why are we subsidizing one kind of art and not another? We have to make choices, but they should be politically driven, clear, explicit choices. And Lukács was saying, yes, but no expressionism. This stuff is ugly, it's bad, and it alienates everybody. But aspects of that are found in a more subtle way in Baudelaire as well. So you had Benjamin arguing with Adorno and with Thomas Mann. So Thomas Mann, in a sense, was in this context considered a bourgeois writer, but Thomas Mann was very anti-expressionism. He hated this ugly art, and Thomas Mann agreed with. Did I say so? Lukács was the key decision maker. That is, the Russians gave the authority to Lukács largely to say who gets the money. And so people were arguing over money, but they were doing so within a way where no one would disagree with communism or with Marxism. So I don't want to simplify in saying this is what it was all about. The reason these are together is because they make the explicit point that you had a deep division between Lukács, who agreed with the bourgeois writer Thomas Mann that expressionism was bad art and it was ugly, versus Bertolt Brecht and Benjamin, who said, we need Bohemia, we need expressionism, we need this ugly stuff, and it should be an integral part of creating a revolution. So you had a little bit of trying to join deeply opposing perspectives and saying this comes from Marx, all by smart people, but fighting with each other, but completely disagreeing on should Bohemia be part of art and communist art or not. And half of them, to simplify, said yes, and half of them said no. So one conclusion which some people have drawn from this is it's very difficult to say this is good communist Marxist art at all. And the relationships between Marxism and art are much more open and weaker in how much variance is explained, in a sense. It's like the social sciences in general, or ideology in general, that even though we can try, these are not deterministic relations, despite the rhetorical dogmatism that you read in the Hollywood essay by Adorno. Okay, so you have two very different kinds of domination versus, yes, we got the money to dominate, or at least to subsidize, but who to give it to? And so we get to Benjamin, and so Bertolt Brecht wrote plays which illustrated this, and he had some essays which were analogous to you could say to well, let me not speak too much about Benjamin. I want to try to let Lena lead off on that. Lena, you want to add your comments on Benjamin here?
Yes. I had a little bit of a more difficult time understanding Benjamin than the piece by Adorno and Horkheim, because he does a little history trip and goes into a lot of different subjects like the diorama, photography, but I'll try to do my best to give an overview.
It's a very subtle, dense, difficult essay to read in English or in German. So go ahead.
Yes. Benjamin starts out with giving kind of introduction to the arcades, which we saw already in the video, are these kind of streets that are covered in like a iron frame and glass. And so he also talks, and these came into being in Paris during the decade which followed 1922. They were the forerunners of department stores.
1822.
1822. And the Center for Luxury Goods Trade. And they created kind of this miniature city or world. And he goes on to talk about the iron frames because they were unique to have been used there, because for the most part, they were too just like the technology, the production was not there to actually make anything like any kind of building structure out of iron. So they were mostly used for these arcades, exhibitions, and railway stations. And pretty much what is being said here is that the construction of the arcades was kind of like the subconscious. It was a blueprint of what was to come, which is, I mean, there was a lot to come, like before we mentioned malls and what we have today. So also a professor talked about this kind of this machinery idea of society. And here Benjamin refers to the philosopher Fourier.
Fourier is the pronunciation.
Fourier,
Yeah.
Who was a utopian philosopher and who wanted society to run smoothly like a machine, where there was no necessity for morality. And this is kind of what these arcades are becoming or pointing at. And then Benjamin goes on to discuss the historical process. And here he kind of criticizes that traditional history neglects to discuss the effort that is made by society to create new inventions and behaviors within a universe of illusory distraction. And this is kind of what he's trying to do. So he's starting out with a diorama, which is a model representing a scene in a three-dimensional figure, which can be either miniature or a large-scale model. And this then progressed to photography. And the photography kind of destroyed these miniature portraits. And then he goes on to discuss world expeditions, which he connects to the commodity fetishism, so the world expeditions were a place where workers were entertained and used as customers. And this taught the workers to believe in exchange value by the display of luxury goods from a world marketplace. And these world expeditions, they came from these national exhibitions of industry, where the first one took place in 1798, and they were aimed at satisfying the desire to amuse the working class. They were the framework for the entertainment industry, and they provided kind of a public festival. And it was through these world exhibitions that a universe of commodities was erected. And then Benjamin goes on to discuss the emergence of the individual person. And here he also touches on the subject of private versus public space, which is, I feel like this also comes up in Habermas and the second part reading of today. So it was previously it was that the living space was distinguished from the place of work, and it was very individualized. But then there was a shattering of this interior kind of focus. So the office became much more personalized by the end of the 19th century. And then Benjamin circles kind of back to the arcades, which
Yeah, let
came
me
around
stop
at
just,
during-
stop just a second. You hear there the opposite of what Adorno was saying, that the office could be personalized, and that made it different from commodification. So you have contradictory themes being raised here. So go ahead, Lena.
Okay. Sorry. So then Benjamin circles back to this idea of the flaneur, which in French it's literally means like stroller, lounger, or loafer. And so I guess it's just like a person who navigates this space of the arcades or the department store.
Yeah, arcades, but not department store. The flaneur died with the department store. The flaneur was a man with a woman maybe on his arm, but he was the key player, according to Benjamin and the others. The key shopper in the department store was the woman without the men, and the men left, and they became hunters and did other things instead of being flaneurs after about 1890. There's a combination of feminism with transformation of shopping as in terms of the scholarship on this. But go ahead, Lena.
Okay, and this is also the part where Baudelaire's poetry enters like the analysis, and this is where I got a little lost, and I don't know if we can pick it up here as a class maybe.
Yeah, I would say maybe stop there. That is, you've done an excellent job on both of these very well. Adorno's essay is strongly stated, but it's simple. This is very complicated, and it's got contradictory themes of people reacting against one another, and so more strongly even than in Adorno. So I would say the big themes to pay attention to, or put differently, half of what is in Benjamin is simple standard Marxism. He talks about the boulevards were built in order to have the military patrol and to put down any potential revolution. So we won't have an 1848 revolution again because the boulevards are safer for the military to patrol and to crush any political resistance. So that's a simple Marxist interpretation. The flaneur, in a sense, is an anti-Marxist interpretation. The flaneur says capitalism is driven by the search for the more beautiful umbrella or necktie or red shoes, and shopping and looking at the street windows of these various objects and saying which will fit your style and my suit and this activity better. That kind of conversation, and then more generalizing, how does this aesthetic fit with going to the ballet or the opera or a particular restaurant? That kind of connection, and then theorizing about aesthetics is what was was done and then was theorized more by Benjamin, as saying you have this not just in Marx, not just in the flaneur, in a sense, who is the flaneur is a classic impressionist painting topic of the man with a ballerina on his arm. Ballerinas are not expected to be feminist, smart, individualistic women, but they even okay. So the point is the flaneur and the consumer drives the economy. That's the Marxist revolution. And so he didn't say that. He didn't spell it out clearly. And in a sense, it's the opposite of Adorno's essay on Hollywood. Adorno says the capitalist owner of Warner Brothers, Mr. Warner, imposes his views about politics or the life on the minds of everybody in America and China and the world where they watch these Hollywood movies. Benjamin is saying the opposite. He's saying when you're shopping, when you're looking for things which you want, you are leading to people to produce umbrellas or shoes or neckties that are more beautiful, and they compete with each other for consumers who will have more subtle and responsive tastes. And so the driver of capitalism in that model is the opposite of what we saw with Adorno. That's why they were in deep conflict. That's the most fundamental. So in a sense, the proletarian was the driver for Marx. The flaneur was the driver for Benjamin. That's why this is so important and why there's sensitive issues in China today, as China moves from a production to a consumption economy. So these are very sensitive political issues around the world from a Marxist standpoint. And of course, the flaneur is linked with entertainment, with mechanical reproduction, with photographs and phonographs, sound, music, and it uses the marketplace. So there's a mixture of capitalism and its institutions of selling things, but the capitalist institutions are fighting with each other to give the flaneur what the consumer wants. Okay, so I would say that that's enough for us to work from in terms of the yeah, and I won't even try to seriously go into the bohemian part, but that's well, okay. Let me see. Let's stop for a bit here. Let's have a little bit of conversation from anyone else who's heard what we've discussed, and see if anybody has questions or comments on what of anything you may have heard or read so far. Lena, thank you. You've done a great job. These are difficult things, and you've presented a fair amount of the subtlety very nicely.
I'm not quite sure if you could consider this a question, but I'm still a bit confused about that comparison between Adorno's notion of, the capitalist studio owner as driver of capitalist production versus the flaneur, because at least at first glance, and having read over these for the first time and, only once, it seems like this notion of the flaneur on the one hand and the passive consumer on the other are both different temporally, one being, in the 50s and 60s and whatnot, in a different age of production, and also in terms of class. The flaneur, it seems to me restricted to a certain type of person who is, who has this idle time, who has the time and perhaps the environment to produce these aesthetic sensibilities. So I'm wondering if that changes with the department store? Is the department store in Benjamin's case still too isolated socially? You know, because only so many people have access to the Parisian department stores like Le Bon Marché, for example. So how do those come into conversation if they're playing on different temporal fields, or are they not? And am I missing something on that front?
Well, I think that the simple answer to your good question is that there's been a lot of economic development through the 19th and the 20th century. And if we just look at post-World War II, look at China or Korea, which were poor countries in 1945, and now they're hugely affluent and there's much more choice. And so whereas it was appropriate for, in some respects, to look, say, at the Versailles and Louis XIV as being predecessors, that is, of the aristocracy and the royalty, or Goetz's discussion of the royal progress in 19th or 18th century Indonesia, this was only a small number of people. But what has changed in China and the world in the last 20 and 10 years is that there has been a huge increase in income for everybody. Not, I shouldn't say everybody, but compared to Versailles, when the, you know, we're talking about a few hundred people, we're now talking about millennials. So the description of millennials is a little bit like the people of the salons or the court of the 18th and earlier centuries. So, so the simple answer is simply, yes, you're right. It's different for sure. There's much more funding in there. And on the other hand, the writings, huge popular writings today, like Amy Cha, Battle Cry of the Tiger Mom, of if you're Asian and you're Chinese and you're in a Western context, how should you raise your daughter? And the old style is production, beat down that little Korean girl, and you've got to be first in your class, or, you know, you're not going to get dinner, and so forth. Versus, oh, what would you like to do today? Okay, so progressive education and letting the child or the consumer have legitimacy in defining policies for herself or the market, the type of shoes to be produced. In that sense, the idea that the consumer is the driver is a simple enough idea, but the big change is, which you're pointing to rightly, and I'm saying it's not necessarily, and I'm saying, look at it within its own historic context. Yes, there were only a handful of flaneurs in the way that they're described in Benjamin and Baudelaire. But if we look at the masses of people who are shopping in department stores or malls or online, and the malls are now worried about the online shoppers of Amazon in the US and similar counterparts in China or France or Germany, is that we live in a broadly much more affluent world where there are many more people spending more time with leisure. They're not writing music the way Adorno did, for sure, but at least they're making consumer-like decisions. And so where and how we have a democratization of consumption decisions is what we're reading about in other readings, and we'll talk about more in Habermas in the next session today. That is the contrast, the visible contrast between England and the continent is a dramatic historical counterpart to this same point I'm making about the flaneur. In a sense, what I'm doing, I guess, is joining two things. And when I'm talking about consumers and consumption, I'm talking about the rise of affluence for the whole society. even if it doesn't literally apply in a short time period. In the last 30 years, there has not been a serious increase in affluence of the lower income groups in the US and in the West generally. It's been concentrated in the top third or so. There's a stratification in that sense that the rich people have gotten a lot richer. The people in the middle have gotten a little bit richer. People at the bottom are about the same, more or less. But except for Saskia Sassen's interpretation, they haven't really gone down. They haven't really gotten substantially poorer. The people who are poor people in New York City, which Saskia Sassen is saying, look at these poor people. They came from places which were much poorer still. They came from rural Peru, rural Mexico, rural islands in the Caribbean, that is Jamaicans, where they went to New York because they're earning more money in New York and sending it back to Mexico and the Philippines. The main driver of the economy of Mexico and the Philippines is what? Anybody know? Transfer payments. People go abroad and they send their money home, or they take it back home. And so there's a redistribution of wealth internationally to the poorer countries based on being in a rich Wall Street Manhattan, even if compared to the people who have the biggest fortunes in Manhattan, are much higher than the people who are making croissant or working as a nanny, who came from a poor country, but they're still earning enough money in New York to send it back to the Philippines or to Mexico. So in that sense, these are two. So in that sense, the consumer can be less affluent, of course, than the flaneur literally in the 19th century. But nevertheless, Mexicans coming here who may have come from a poor farming background are nevertheless learning about the many different kinds of shoes and tables and chairs and headphones that you can listen to if you go to Target or go to Sears Roebuck or whatever. Does that make sense? Okay. What if we start? Yeah. Anybody else have a? I mean, it's good to bring that out. Anybody else have a question a little bit like that, or anything else that you want to either question or challenge, or just note anything that? Okay, let's start talking, because the second half is shorter in time with our break. Let's start talking about Habermas, because Habermas was a student in Frankfurt. He was the official brilliant next generation. He was the heir of Adorno and Horkheimer. He was going to take over when they retire. And he was in the photo in the background with his hand in his hair. His doctorate was done, and we have a selection from his it's not the PhD, it's called the Habilitation, which is a sort of bigger, fancy doctorate. We don't have that in the US. Let's talk a little bit about Habermas. Lena, you want to go ahead on that?
I can give a small overview. So let's see. Yeah, so I mean, already on the syllabus, it says that he focused on the public sector and really looked at a lot of like public places and specific coffee shops and salons and what happened there. But so we read chapters 1 and 2. And so in chapter 1, he defines the term public sphere, and he does this in a discussion of public of the private versus public. And first of all, he recognizes that the precision of these terms is not that great. So there's no like just one definition for what public means. But he kind of goes back into history, and he looks at the Greek categories of polis and oikos, I don't know, the division of those two, and recognizes that there's already kind of a division between public and private, but it's different from the modern idea. And then he goes on in his discussion to analysis of the Roman law, and then from there the Middle Ages. And here he looks at the public and recognizes that during this time publicity was mainly a status attribute, and only after the modern states had destroyed the feudal power, the development of a capitalist economy was possible, and this new this public and private spheres as we know it today separated and are what we know right now. So this happened during the 18th century. And really how this public sphere that we know right now came into being was through this through capitalism and through trade. So long distance trade brought people together that weren't really connecting before. And then also the news just connected people, brought things out into the public. And then also the tax system was developed. And so by this time, the public referred mainly to the state apparatus. And so that's, I would say that's.
Okay, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say he goes on into this discussion of capitalism and the idea of public as kind of the state, but yeah. Okay. Then I don't know if there's anything you would like to add to chapter 1. But then pretty much the main point is made in chapter 2, where he analyzes these public places such as the coffee shops. And I thought this was really interesting, especially after having read Adorno and Horkheimer, who were saying that there's no room for creativity and critical reflection on society. He was saying here that the institutions such as salons and coffee shops shaped the literary public sphere. And it was a bridge between the representative and the bourgeoisie public spheres. So these coffee houses and salons were kind of the central aspect of towns, and they created centers of literary and political criticism. And here he introduces the idea of reason. And he's saying that reason was developed in the discussions that were taking place in these coffee shops or houses and salons. And then this is like the way how they reach the public. And this is also how critical writing about art and literature was able to emerge. So this, yeah, kind of just what I wanted to give an overview of Habermas. So.
I mean, that was, we're near our break time. I'll just add 2 minutes before, directly building on what you said, which was great as far as it went. And he stressed at the beginning, the public because this is a new non-Marxist concept. Even though he was using a lot of Marxist analysis in The Rise of Capitalism, the New Institutions, and so forth, commodification. But he doesn't just talk about commodification at all the way Adorno does. He as you pointed out, he points to the two, that the places like coffee houses and salons, and that the point you didn't get to the next point, which is there's a dramatic difference between England and the continent. By the continent, he means mainly France, Germany, Italy. He's not talking about Switzerland or the Netherlands, which are exceptions. They're closer to England. But if you look at England, in England, you could write political tracts, John Locke, John Stuart Mill, these kinds of things. These were circulated as political tracts and debated, what is democracy? How can we make a good democracy? But they also debated over, will your ship come in from India with all of its tea and its other things, and I'll make you a bet. I'll wager with you that your ship will not get here. And then how many people will put how much money on will it arrive or will it not? That in turn led to insurance companies. Lloyd's of London insures everything. This in turn led to the English and the world stock market, investment in companies. These were done in an original form in the coffee shops of London. There were 600 coffee shops in something like the 18th century. There were lots of these, and people were doing business initially that way, and then these became separate businesses. By contrast, sharp contrast, in France and Germany, there was tough censorship. You could not talk about business in this way. You could not talk about politics at all. The books would be censored, they would be seized. You would be expelled from France or Germany, as Marx was, for thinking or writing something as revolutionary as he was moving toward. So what did they talk about instead? Aesthetics, the arts, beauty, flaneurs who chose neckties and umbrellas were refined and refined and refined in Paris as an alternative to building the industrial, dirty economy of the smokestacks. So the point is, both of these were going on simultaneously in the 19th century, with Paris and London as two extreme alternatives. The people who made their money in London would come to Paris and maybe build a big house in the middle of Paris with the money which they generated by building smokestacks in Manchester, England. So what Habermas is thus doing is looking at then the specific vehicles. So he identifies the cafes, he identifies publications, censorship, as well as the editors of the journals, the newsletters from which these originated. Then they became, in the 19th century, mass newspapers. And then he suggests that the capitalist domination drove out the literary leaders who had created these initially, and especially in the continent. So in Germany and France, he traces these by name. He has lots of some of Adorno and Horkheimer is very loose and abstract and theoretical. Habermas here is very concrete. He's done a lot of careful historical research, as did Benjamin. So they're looking at very specific things and contrasting them. And the content of the conversation in the coffee shop versus the cafe, or the salon, which was the Parisian, it was not the court. These were Parisian women, generally older women, who wanted to have their beautiful home used, and they wanted to have beautiful people come and talk, and they would decide who to invite, who could be brought to talk with someone else, then to have someone perform on the piano and they talk about the music of Ravel, the music of Wagner, the music, and then they might have someone read some poetry, and they would discuss aesthetics predominantly, not politics. Read Stendhal's novels or read the 19th century French novels. Nobody ever works. All they talk about is the aesthetic style of the way she wears her hat on top of that, along with that dress. Those are the issues. And does that make you want to be in love with her? Absolutely, etc. So those are the kinds of things which are featured, decomposing the crude determinism of Adorno into more subtle dynamics, including love, including sensuality, romance, in its subjective elements, but they are linked with, they're contrasted with England and France in ways that then in the 20th century, we have both, or the 21st century in China, we have now all of these going on simultaneously. Let's take a little break there for 15 minutes. It's 6:04, come back in 15 minutes, and you've got stuff to think about, and let's talk about how to put these all together. We can bring in more of Habermas if you want, but you've got the core ideas in front of you now, lots of ideas, and they are contradicting each other. That's what's interesting. Okay. Philosophical tradition, as the American philosophical tradition, which was ignored by most of the Marxist European macro social theorizing. So Habermas, and then here at Chicago today, Hans Joas continue this combination of social interaction as generating a new identity and a shared social consciousness, combined with the abilities to reconceptualize in aesthetic cultural terms, both how you can see the perspective of someone else and how it relates to you, and how those in turn can generate a public sphere which may or may not be the same as a combination, or it may be somewhat distinct. But this is not Warner telling Faulkner what he wants in the movie. Faulkner worked as a $15 an hour or whatever script writer to pay his bills. And then when he didn't have, when he had a little bit of money, he'd write his great novels. So Faulkner hated working in Hollywood, but he went there because it was the highest pay he could get in the short amount of time. So that's the Hollywood which many people hated and do hate and see it as capitalism embodied, or Wall Street is capitalism embodied. But what Habermas, who was a Marxist in background and training at the leading Frankfurt School, is saying the opposite in many respects. He's saying the opposite of what Adorno said about Hollywood. Okay, let me stop there and let you comment. Question, challenge, whatever. What happened, or just one more point, what happened in between the 1968 revolution? Was it a proletarian revolution, the way Marx had forecast? Was it an economic revolution? No. What was it? Who were the leaders? Were they proletarian, blue-collar workers? No. It was on college campuses. And so, as we'll discuss as we continue, the new proletariat is you, students, thinkers, ideas, new ideas. That's the revolution. Okay, so this fits, this kind of Daniel Bell connection joins the pieces together in ways that shows how the flaneur of the 19th century and the pre-68, post-68 analysis are all part of an integrated world. And that's the point of Schills, criticizing daydreams and not nightmares. Not to say you don't have to trash Joan Baez or popular culture. If some people want to have popular culture, let them go to simple-minded Hollywood movies. But you can go to any other kind of movie you want, and we can have all of this side by side, or from 4:30 to 7 o'clock, you can have one movie followed by another movie in the same movie house. They can have the same people selling you the same popcorn, but you can have totally different cultural experiences, even in the same place. Okay, so that's the essence of the pluralism in Schills's critique of Daydreams and Nightmares, which is his title, making fun of Adorno's simplism. Simplismus is the German word. Okay. All right. Further comment from anyone? Lots of big things, lots of big words, but I'm trying to get the core ideas and show you both the simple and how the complicated grew out of reactions against the too simple. Think of Blaylock and Stinchcomb drawing boxes and arrows. Think of your own MAs. Think of how can you build on and say something new in your MA in the spirit that they're saying we need scientific and cultural advancement. And how can we do that in this course in the last hour we have today? Less than an hour.
I'm still kind of thinking about the flaneur and how it relates to my project. Yeah.
But how that what?
The flaneur.
Flaneur. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, flaneur. And how it relates to my project, because a lot of the people who engage in the lifestyle that I'm studying object to the rampant consumption that they witness in America.
Yes.
And so I'm thinking of, I'm just like really stuck on the idea of kind of that consumer driving capitalism. But I'm getting caught in the loop because capitalism kind of cajoles the consumer about what to purchase. So it seems kind of like a self-reinforcing loop there.
Yeah, I think I mentioned briefly a session or two back that everybody in the 1930s sort of thought that propaganda, movies, radio went right into people's heads and they ran right out and they bought the tomato soup or the type of cigarette that was advertised. Then people started to study this, said, do people really do that? And this was Paul Lazarsfeld. And Lazarsfeld hired Adorno and Horkheimer to work with him in New York when they first arrived in the US. They didn't go to Hollywood. They went to, but they didn't get a nice office. He didn't have much money. He was a young professor at Columbia, and he had a rented space in a dirty building in Newark, New Jersey. And Adorno went there once and he said, I'm not going to work here. You know, there used to be driven in a Mercedes with a chauffeur to Communist Party cell meetings. So they went to Hollywood. Okay. But Adorno continued for 5, 6, 7 years, launching marketing research, political analysis, national surveys and local surveys to try to answer those questions. And the basic answer was, most of the advertising, most of the content of most of what people see, and this was a big issue in World War II, with the approaching World War II, and then during World War II, getting people to eat certain foods only, to ration, to accept this as a patriotic duty. There was a lot of open propagandistic movies and stuff done by the US government. And social scientists are trying to help the war in that sense. And what they found, again and again, as I mentioned with the Wehrmacht, with the German army soldiers, the bombings, these big things didn't have much impact alone. Combined with conversations of someone they knew, that could have an impact. That's called the two-step theory of communication, that the media could affect you mainly if it came through someone you knew and trusted. And if you didn't know and trust somebody, you might just throw out the magazines, or at least you wouldn't believe them. So in that sense, the collective perception that the media were hugely important largely disappeared when there was serious research. Now, that's not to say, as Lazarsfeld said from the beginning, that they're not longer term, multiple generational kinds of differences, which can still be enhanced by growing up, going to, meetings of the Boy Scouts or the Komsomol in Russia, or East Germany versus West Germany. Clearly, there were huge differences which were there, but how much was specifically added by the media or by an effort by the national government is still remains a gray area. So, and that's why that's why lots of people in China are very interested in cultural policy. It includes censorship. It includes everything on the internet. It includes policing the big tech firms, regulating who can produce and do what in China. So these are hot issues today. And in many cases, we just don't know for some things. For instance, how important is Confucianism and deference to the family, which goes back for centuries and centuries in China, or what was done by Mao in the Little Red Book or the Cultural Revolution, or what's on the social media defining cultural nationalism is eating kimchi, not saying that that's a Korean food. That's a hard question, and we don't have no one can give you a precise answer to that question. But I guess what we can say is it's not just the one or the other. It's probably some combination of all of these, and that depends on educational levels and cosmopolitanism and intelligence and training and having parents who point these things out to you versus parents who say, no, you'll be spanked if you say anything different. How much is spanking important? And so forth. But I guess the only, okay, I don't want to overstate, but have you seen anything in some of your conversations about, say, the material versus the symbolic aspects of consumption or consumerism? Like conformity, does everybody dress the same way increasingly or less so? And how does that compare to 30 or 50 years ago in the US or in Asia? You've been to Japan or China, or say especially Japan? What kinds of suits do men, at least in the 20 years ago, what kind of clothes did Japanese men wear? They all looked as if they all went to Sears Roebuck and they all got the same blue suit. Everybody dresses the same way. You can't tell if they're multi-billionaires or if they're clerks in the low level of an office. So in that sense, to say that materialism transforms, what drives what is tricky. But I guess what I'm saying is consumerism is by no means reduced simply to the material buying of goods, of shopping. And so what Benjamin stressed with the flaneur was not going in and putting the money down and giving it to his girlfriend and saying, here, look and be indebted to me because I bought you this. That's the kind of crude image of consumerism. What Benjamin is talking about is looking at the window, through the window, looking at the neckties and say, oh no, we don't like any of those. And going to the next store, are these any better neckties? No, we don't like those either. Then let's go to the next one. Ah, that's got a nice blue to it. Do you like that blue? That's what the flaneur does. And then try to say, why does blue fit with you because you're a girl or you're not a girl? And what does that say about gender or whatever? That's the kind of conversation that a flaneur would have. And buying the object is immaterial. Many, many people write about consumption and they ignore the second. And there's a lot, I mean, there's more to that in turn. I mean, I've talked, for instance, about New Englanders versus Southerners. In the American South, you have something closer to that. But what's the main store which features that in its marketing and has for years? And they have Christmas gifts. They have airplanes you can give your husband if you want as a Christmas stocking gift. Neiman Marcus. Neiman Marcus, the Texas big, elegant department store, the flashy consumer consumption style department store is the featured aspect of a huge new complex in Upper Manhattan right now. And the whole place is bankrupt. Neiman Marcus is bankrupt right now. They didn't listen to the flaneurs. Or put differently, the New England moralists in Salem did not shop that way. They were mountain climbing. They were walking to get exercise. They were doing good work to help the disadvantaged and poor people. What's the most favorite activity of American high school, not high school, American college students is what? What's the main extracurricular activity that students do at the University of Illinois or California or wherever, and the USC, same thing. Tutor high school students and younger low income, especially minority, Black, and maybe Mexican students. That's the most favorite activity and that it fits a New England moralistic good works, help the disadvantaged model of life. You don't give them money, you don't take them money away from them, you help their minds work better. That has nothing to do with consumption as a material activity or exchange of activities. But this is a country with both Neiman Marcus and doing good works in Salem, Massachusetts. And if you look closely, I bet you find both on the Chinese nationalism website and the Retiring at 35 website. Young Chinese, then we haven't talked about it, and I'll just mention it now briefly. We have a book which was written, I wrote with Megan Kalman, at the invitation of the two ministries. I guess it was the Ministry of Economics and the Ministry of, I think it's called Civil Affairs, and it's called The Third Sector. It came out in Chinese about 5 years, and then we spent 5 years revising it to make it more general than just Chinese. But it compares China, Japan, Korea, France, and the US and their third sector dynamics in building trust and legitimacy. And what it does is critique both Bowling alone and Jeffrey Alexander is having too simple a view of how the third sector works. And so what we found, I didn't know how true this was, is young people today in Japan, in Taiwan, and mainland China have joined and created a massive third sector that did not exist 20, 30 years ago. And they did this when there were things like floods from rivers in China and the tsunami disasters in Japan. And so young people and I've had many students with COVID who left the USC who've gone home to China to package bandages, masks for people to get in China. Right at the beginning of this, there's a strong sense of a similar kind of helping the disadvantaged and people who suffered from a flood, combined maybe with nationalism, combined with patriotism, combined with a sense of guilt. I don't know. So I'd say these are not Neiman Marcus. These are not Wall Street. These are not Warner Brothers, is my suggestion. And I'm building here pretty directly on the competition among Adorno, Habermas, and Benjamin. So I'm following, I would say, the best of Benjamin and Habermas, and I'm disagreeing with the simple Adorno in my reading. But I'm not saying anything that's not already in the words of these people that we've read today. How about the two of you that I'm implicitly talking about, and your websites and your readings? Have you tried to classify what is Chinese nationalism in terms of any of this, or see any ways that gives you handles on doing that? Or the same thing for people when they're going to retire at 35. What are they going to do, and why are they retiring at 35, and what will they do when they retire? And what are the intellectual frameworks that you've got that you could use, that you've read about, and even the last 2 or 3 weeks? You've been exposed to several.
Professor, you just mentioned the cultural policies, like China's cultural policies, right? I feel a bit confused about the cultural policies that you just mentioned, because, I mean,
Yeah, I hear you. I'm just turning the fan up a little bit. You feel confused by the cultural policies because of what?
because like historically, like China's like so all cultural like resources in China were actually owned by the state, and cultural production, dissemination involved state investment, and all of them were actually carried out by the state-owned institutions. But after 1979, the opening up and reform of China, so the government actually separate the concept. So we have one is there's a distinction between cultural industries and cultural services. So cultural services are just provided by the state-supported agencies, while cultural like industries are provided by like private-owned like enterprises. So how can we, because you just mentioned nationalism and Confucianism, so how can we combine or relate the cultural policy with nationalism and Confucianism? Because I did not see a very clear combination, relation between the cultural policies and these two terms.
All right, why is there a contradiction? There's a contradiction only if you have in your head that the content of the culture is explained by the ownership and the distribution of the product. That is, and you're contrasting the government and private. That's too simple. What I'm saying is go to people's heads and see what's in their heads, and then ask, where and why is it there? And say, take a library or a bookstore. A bookstore may be private, a library may be public. You have both of them, and they may be next door to each other in China or in the US. You can have a Chicago Public Library next to a Chinatown bookstore and they're both right next to each other. You can go to either one. And is your experience that different if you read or you choose books in the one or the other, one of which is officially? So I'm saying, don't feel that they must be different. Now they are if the only books in the government library are 5,000 copies of the Little Red Book and nothing else. But even under the Cultural Revolution, there probably were 2 or 3 other books. And second, as I listened and talked with the Chinese who were studying these things, they are showing that in the 3,000 libraries across all 3,000 counties of China, they're trying to increase participation. And what they're finding is they're getting a big increase in participation when they let individual users of the public library, television and so forth, computer screens, choose their own content. That is, they don't see just what the books are in the library. They can access stuff on Google, maybe not on Google literally, but on Weibo. And there are all kinds of websites and discussion boards. And there's a massive increase in the types and diversity of information. And that's a potentially very dangerous thing. That's why both in the US and especially in China, these big tech firms are being very sensitively monitored by the governments. More in Europe, more still in China, and somewhat in the US, but these are everywhere a concern. And I would simply say, we just don't yet know how much it's like the mass media in the 1930s and 40s. We don't yet know exactly over a long time how much impact they're having compared to what your mother says, compared to what your friends say in school, compared to other things. How's that sound? So I'm not disagreeing. I'm saying you're framing it in a one-to-one black and white deterministic way, and you may not even realize how much you're doing that, but I'm pointing it out. And I'm asking you, which theorist has said don't do that? Max Weber said, don't just look at the economy, look also at status. But then when we got to Levi-Strauss and Wagner, what did they say? What's the idea of the integrated artwork that is Gesamtkunstwerk of Wagner and Levi-Strauss's myths? How many myths did Levi-Strauss study? 1, 2, no. Did he study only kimchi? Did he study only rural urban? No. He has hundreds of little societies and hundreds of components of feminism or matriarchy or domination or reverse domination, the Oedipus myth versus the man carrying the woman on his shoulders and who's practically killing him. I mean, all of these are different myths, and you have counterparts in China if you look more closely. So I'm saying you've been exposed to many different ways of theorizing, or when Max Weber wrote about the religion of China, he didn't say here's one Chinese nationalism. He said here are many different ideal types. They're different Chinese. They're overseas traders. They're government bureaucrats, the mandarins. They're municipal shoppers and shop owners, peasants, and each of these have different worldviews. So you can try to put them together and say this is China, but any one of them has very different things in their heads. So why should that, if that was true 5,000 or 1,000 or 550 years ago, isn't it even more true today that you've got many different kinds of people watching the same social media talking about what is Chinese nationalism, Or what should we do after 35? Or how should we talk about feminism in China? Feminism for whom? For which kinds of women? So one thing you could do, for instance, all of you that I'm implicitly mentioning, you could have a chapter in the beginning of an MA which says, here are 7 different ways of theorizing how components of feminism fit together. Not 1, not 3, maybe 7. And they could be from Levi-Strauss, from Goetz, from Max Weber, or from Adorno and Habermas. What were the roles of women then in Habermas? We haven't talked about gender yet. Right? I did a little bit, but who can talk? Let's just elaborate briefly on feminism from just what you've heard and then what you may have read about England versus France and the role of women. Were women leading participants in these coffee shops in London when they were building the London stock market or shipping and they were buying the products of ships? No, these were mainly men. And they often were called men's clubs, and then but by contrast, who were the leaders in Paris? They were women. They were older women who led the salons. They were older women who would be sort of flirting with the king. They would be younger women who would be seducing the courtiers and others, and who were written up in the novels of Stendhal. And then you would have women jealous of each other who were written up by Saint-Simon and court life. That is, all of these things are going on simultaneously. But women were much more important if you look at the writings of French novels in the 19th century than if you look at the content of the conversation in the London coffee shops. So I'm not saying one is good or bad. I'm not saying women are more or less important in general. I'm simply saying the content of women's specific roles were and are very different in different subgroups. And I mentioned in Chicago, maybe I didn't put it this simple way, my African-American neighbors are basically surrounding me with a matriarchy. Women own the apartments, or they own the condos, or they rent the apartments. Their boyfriends come and visit for a while, but their children are taken care of by their aunts and their sisters. The men are disconnected. So some of them find gangs, some of them find other things, but they're not structuring the kinship or the relationship with children. Most young boys don't know their fathers at all. Okay, the white Catholics from Poland, from Italy, from Germany in Chicago tend to be patriarchal. Men dominate in those traditionally in those countries before they came to the US, and to some degree still today. Third, you have Protestants and Jews, like in Hyde Park or the North Side, where you have egalitarianism. We are all equal and we want to make everybody more equal. These are 3 different views of gender, conflicting views of gender in one city at one time. And they go back for centuries in the examples we're talking about, including China. I had one student from a town about 100 miles from, I'm not sure exactly, but something like that, outside Shanghai. And he said You know, I grew up surrounded by the arts, by poetry, by pottery, by beauty, aesthetics. And I said, really, how did that happen? So, well, I grew up in this special town outside of Shanghai. How did it get that way? Why was it so focused on aesthetics and the arts? Well, it's where many of the gentlemen from Shanghai had their mistresses. That's a Parisian institution, or a Parisian strolling flaneur kind of distinctive it's outside the strong family. Which was and is still there at the same time that you've got other things going on in China, and that's been true for centuries. So you have a little Paris outside Shanghai, and you have a big London in the middle of Shanghai. And Shanghai is, booming with all of its economic activities. But there's a book called Shanghai Nightlife, written by a Chicago trained sociologist. And he talks about, did people in the 1930s, 40s, this is before Mao, 30s, 40s, 50s, dance or not? He has specific discussion of gender roles and nightlife in Shanghai. So I'm simply saying there's a lot of diversity within China if you let yourself look. The biggest one being what is rural and what is urban. We have silence from people working on feminism. How about you two? You two are 3 borderline, or anything more? How does this relate? Yeah, okay, let's stick with feminism themes and gender roles a little bit. Anybody want to comment on how these later readings by, say, Habermas, Paris versus London, the coffee shop versus a salon, the aristocratic court versus the market of the street, how do these relate to gender roles in ways that you want to write about them in your MAs right now? And how could you in any way use anything that we've been reading that would give you you don't need to say, I will follow this or that one theory. You can say, here are 12 theories or 7 theories, and I may assess how well they work and where and why. And that would be a legitimate way to proceed. That is, you don't need to you can choose to spend half your PhD or half of your MA collecting data. And I would say that's a waste of time. Lots of people have collected lots of data. If you look, spend most of your time thinking and reasoning and putting together the data which exists out there. There are many, many surveys, many, many empirical ethnographic studies of China and of the US and of Europe. But to join this with alternative competing theories and say, where and why do they make sense? And you may want to use 4 different theories for 4 different aspects of different gender roles, as we have done in this course already. So I'm giving you a hint, but I'm listening for some kind of discussion. Okay, anybody else can make suggestions about gender roles in China or the world if you want to. That's in part sort of the theme with Teo. Teo, you want to comment on any of this? How does any of this relate to your MA plans?
So I think it relates, well, the way I've been thinking about the relation has been a bit different than specifically to gender roles, but more about.
Yeah, sorry, I was confusing T-E-O with T-H-E-O, Evans. So I don't want to leave you out, but I was trying to not have you leave unless you want to include women. I mean, I think it was a woman who stole the computer of of someone in the U.S. Congress. If you want to talk about the number of men or women in your, or say, yeah, how many of the Proud Boys are women? Or do they say anything about gender roles?
Teo, do you want to take this over and then I'll hop in after because it corresponds more to his project?
Okay.
Sure. Could I actually ask sort of a side question of just something I've been thinking through?
Sure, please do.
Yeah, so this is less related to gender, but I guess I was just thinking, since I'm looking largely at online communities, and you talked about this a little bit, but just about how some of these ideas could apply on social media. And I think I was especially thinking of that. I think it applies to everything we read pretty much, but I was especially thinking of that with the Adorno and Horkheimer, where I think social media challenges some of the ideas they have about especially about the uniformity of media. And I think that there's a lot of media that's made by a wider variety of people and is sort of more personalized and targeted. So I was wondering if anyone has thoughts on thinking through that alongside what we've read about the culture industry.
No, absolutely, very, very powerful point, which one could almost say refutes Adorno's main argument. 20%, 30%, 80%. It certainly undermines its determinism, and it's written as a deterministic story. So if you got 20% or 50% or more refuting, as counterexamples, it ain't determinism. So excellent point. Yes, nobody said that until you did right now, but that's very important. Who owns the means of production of social media? Marxian question, but a messy answer. There ain't no clear right answer. Is it you who own your phone? Is it Weibo? But Weibo is not what you're studying when you're studying a smaller specific social media site. Is it the censors? Is it the people behind the censors? Okay, let's turn to the Proud Boys. If you want, then we can come back to feminism in China or whatever. How about any follow-up? Teo, how do you pronounce your last name again?
Ichirek.
Ichirek, okay, great.
Well, I think the insurrection was about, was it 85 or 94% male majority? The Proud Boys are 100% male. Their one membership restriction is actually based on gender. And moreover, there is an organization called the Proud Boys' Girls, which is like the female wing of this, Western chauvinist group, kind of like in the 1920s, the KKK then had a women's KKK alongside, even though I think there was probably, actually, I don't know the dynamics between them, but I know that women aren't allowed, they're not admitted to Proud Boys meetings, even though this pursuit of the opposite sex plays a very big part in Proud Boys culture, because part of their origins is trying to get these lonely men who believe that the West is the best to find partners and settle down and procreate. So the end goal of the Proud Boys, at least from the start, has been settling down in this traditional family structure.
Okay.
And I don't know if anyone wants to take that in another direction, but I think that's the limit of my thoughts on that, just a comment.
Would it be fair to add that there's a strong macho element
Oh, yeah.
in the Proud Boys cultural style?
Yes, absolutely. And that partly I think that's one of the reasons for which, women aren't allowed. They focus a lot on their manhood and on developing, emphasizing, and projecting it. Hence, the name Proud Boy.
And they're doing that in part because they perceive that the mass media and the general political style is the opposite, that a strong gender egalitarianism undercuts a macho gender role. Okay, and that's a very simple, basic point, but it's critical for everything that followed, which you said first. And is this unique to the U.S.? By no means. This is happening all over the world.
I think perhaps it's more entrenched in it could be more entrenched in the mainstream elsewhere, and perhaps rather than a reaction, it could be in a less extreme sense, a part of the norm. I think of Turkey, which is, still to this day, very, very macho. Feminicides are still, the rate of feminicide is very high. Women are killed because, they've tarnished the honor of the father of the family. Let's say, they have a marriage that wasn't authorized by the family. The father and the brothers will seek them out in many more Central Eastern communities in Turkey, but it even happens in Istanbul. They'll seek the daughter or the sister out and either kill her or force her back into the family home, et cetera, et cetera. So it's would be interesting to see how the Proud Boys would respond to this, because a lot of this, alt-right/alt-light groups are also very Islamophobic. So then maybe one would have to make a comparison, not with a majority Muslim country where they could easily say, that's Islam is bad, but rather, a Christian country like Argentina where feminicides are very high, or in Mexico where the case is quite the same. So I think that would be an interesting comparative project. But yeah, I think they're reacting to a different situation, perhaps.
Okay, now excellent point, Saul. What I'm suggesting in the way I said, how about a chapter, is you don't need to say you need to do a different MA. You can simply say, I'm not sure which elements of these various theories we're reading or I've read before, or things that I've seen in the mass media or wherever, I want to use in my MA, but you can briefly tick off and say this approach or this aspect of Turkey or this aspect of Argentina or New England versus, that is, we have lots of macho style in Bronzeville. That's, and it comes in part from the American South. And the US military, as they say, speaks with a Southern accent, whites and blacks. So the military was one of the classically respected, linked to the old European aristocracy, non-capitalist, non-working occupations. It was the aristocracy that took care of everybody, quote unquote. So in that sense, and of course it was super macho. The job of the was to kill and destroy the enemies of countries or regions. And so when then that shifted to chivalry in the Middle Ages, and then in turn to wearing nice military uniforms, and then wearing those so Stendhal will write about in military men coming to a small town in France and how they wear their uniforms and how they get to know women in different contexts. with great detail, but says nothing about actually fighting on the job as an army officer or people who are bankers or anything like that. There's not a word on that kind of stuff. So yes, 2 or 3 points there joined, but that is, you can show some subtlety even in a sentence or two, and people do a little bit of comparisons that way. So there's I have lots and lots of examples, but I'm simply saying, don't say, are you, I mean, you heard our Chinese PhD student talking about his own struggles to analyze the role of the state, the role of the production export economy transforming itself into consumption and lifestyle and using culture. That's what he's trying to do. And these are central issues for China today. But you don't need to say, I'm going to do an entire PhD on just one little aspect of it, but you can still talk about many different kinds of theories, and not only in one chapter at the beginning called a literature review, you can use them all the way through, chapter by chapter, line by line, page by page, and say, where and how does this aspect of what Habermas talked about consistent with that versus this, etc. And you've done that by, I mean, the two of you are brought in the big points of dramatic cases which our Chinese may not have thought about so much or so actively, of killing a daughter who wants to go out with, have a date with, or marry someone who's not chosen by her father. She can be killed for thinking that way, and that's the simple point. This is happening today, not just with ISIS. This is normal in a lot of areas. Okay. Or of course, the social media as destroying the monopoly of Hollywood. It never was really a monopoly. There were competitors, there were Europeans and so forth, European films. Wenbin, you're shaking your head, but you're not saying anything. Anything with your readings of thinking about these, as you're not necessarily writing a specific MA, but anything you want to add? Or
I'm just agreeing with what you just said, and I think that's really inspiring.
Look at China by bringing in the lens of Turkey, of Saudi Arabia, of Mexico, and contrasting the American South of Neiman Marcus with the Boston or Salem. Salem is the small town that's more homogeneous. Moralism, the Puritanism of traditional Calvinist Puritanism. There are books and books and books on these things. So you don't need to write a new book, but you should, as an educated, thoughtful person who's taking and is reading in this class and hearing these things discussed, these are there in your heads now. You can use these tonight. The Frankfurt School is there, even if you never read it before. It's there, and other people who are going to read what you write know about the Frankfurt School. They know about Marx. They know about Max Weber. You're not writing for people who are just dummies or diplomats. Yeah, Lena, any insights on diplomats from your reading? And I compliment you again. You've really thought carefully and presented very nicely both the Frankfurt variations, the anti-Adorno of Habermas, and of Benjamin. Those are three conflicting views. Do they have implications for the roles of diplomats?
So yeah, I thought about this in light of my thesis topic, and really what well, I thought the Adorno Horkheimer piece was really interesting, and I thought about this like with the diplomats, because I feel like they should have a space to reflect on their culture, because they are kind of taken out of it. So they have like their home culture that through being away, they have a chance to reflect on, but also by going into a new culture, they have a chance to reflect on this new culture. I feel like maybe also like Adorno and Horkheimer actually did when they came to Hollywood and saw the whole like Hollywood scene in a very critical light. But then also they're like under the power, I guess, of the diplomatic culture. But I feel that well, I feel like probably kind of controlled not by the economy and capitalism, but rather by, well, maybe to some degree, but I feel like there is also like the state, the state is also a big factor in what the states want, but also the economy. Yeah, so that's kind of where my thoughts went when reading Adorno and Horkheimer.
You're mostly talking about them, but you're not really building on the key additions of Baudelaire, Benjamin, Habermas, and the contrasts between, say, the continent and London. I mean, you have diplomats both in the continent and in London, etc. All right, we're over time now. We've had some beginnings of discussion. When you read or think about these things for the first time, inevitably, that's a cultural shock. But enjoy the cultural shocks and try to let them turn around in the back of your head and see how you can, in some way, include these kinds of examples, which have been, and again, these are major, powerful works. Everything we talked about today, of course, but almost everything in the course. These are big, major ideas. These are not just me in this course. I mean, these are the same that if you took a course on culture in Germany or France or Argentina, you'd read a number of the same things. So if you want to communicate with people who are not just thinking the way you have only alone in the past, think about the Proud Boys, think about the KKK and the women linked to it. Think about love if you're a young Saudi Arabian girl. All right, end of hour. Thank you, folks. I'll stay on if anybody has something personal you want to raise in an office hour. And thank you to Lena for doing an excellent job, and we look forward to next week when we will have two of you presenting again. Okay. Yeah, do we have a hand up from Wenbin? Or